Hi, this video is a crash video on introduction to React, the props and states of a React. So first of all, let us see what is React. React is a JavaScript library created by Facebook, and it is created to build the user interface libraries. So it is also a tool for building user interface components and putting all these components together to build responsive, fast, and dynamic UI components. So let us see how to start with React. So in order to create a React project, so we do have a command line tool called as create React app. So using that tool, I have started to create a project for my demo called as my app. So this is the command which I use to create a local project called as my app. So this is a tool which will build the total environment along with a web server which will allow us to load the app and see the output of the app on the browser by accessing it from a localhost port. So what is all this React about? So how is it different from the normal JavaScript? So React, unlike Angular, it is not a framework. React is a library, just like jQuery. So this React will help us to create most dynamic and quick components which put together will give us a beautiful web page with responsive and dynamic data loading based on the user events. And React depends mostly on virtual DOM concept, where the React is not going to directly interpret the DOM elements, but instead it creates a virtual DOM where which the React uses to compare the current existing DOM with the new changes in the DOM. After that, it is just going to replace only the elements which are changed based on the user events. So once we start with the actual React concept of JSX, which is the basic HTML or the rendering scripting we use in for building the React components. So JSX stands for your JSX stands for JavaScript XML. So this is a standard to create the UI components in React. So they look similar to HTML, but they are not exactly HTML snippets, but they are used inside the JavaScript. So if you have been into JavaScript, you might have never tried to create the elements within the JavaScript tags or the JavaScript scripts. But in React, we are going to do that with the help of JSX. So JSX is an XML-like feature which will allow us to create the components, the dynamic components, which are being rendered by the React library. And React library mainly, in order to use the React library, we mainly use a class called as React. And we import this from a package called as React. And we also, the very first page of the React app also uses one more package called as React DOM. So this React DOM is the one which is responsible for rendering the dynamic components from the UI, and whatever the JSX script you are writing, that will be passed into the JavaScript finally to render the UI components. So let us see if we are done with the creation of the project. Once we are done with the creation of project, so we can just understand how this React project directory looks like. We now have the React project created in the directory we wish to create it. So now this is my directory that is created by my React app command prompt app creation tool. So this contains a lot of directories here, but in this crash course I just want you to directly look into the src folder, which contains the source code for our application. Inside this src directory, we have 3 files with app prefix. So these files are the files which hold the basic components for our application. So index.js, and you do find a index.html inside your public folder. So will be the file where your React application is going to be served. Just let us try to look at this code and the directories, and I am using Visual Studio Code to write as my IDE to write the code. So within Studio Code, we can have some useful extensions that can help us to make our React development quicker. So for now, I've been using simple React snippets and prettier. Okay, this simple React snippets contains the basic code snippets which I'll be frequently using across my application, and prettier is a simple code formatter which helps me to maintain my code look prettier. Okay, so coming back to my files, so inside my src directory and public directory, if I look at them, so I have index.html, which is my first file which will be served to show and display all the components of my React application. And inside the src directory, you can have a look at the app.js, which holds the first components code, and your app.css holds the css related to that. So let us first run this, the basic scaffold what we have. So this boilerplate, we can run it just by opening the integrated terminal inside Visual Studio Code, and the command to run the application within the folder is npm start. So this is a tool. Npm start automatically starts the application in the background and will open up the browser on localhost 3000. This is the location where my React application will be served. So this is the basic landing page, the very first page, which is by default present in the project folder created by create React app command line tool. So now what we can do is we can just go back to this file which contains all the code. So you can see this app.js is my first component. So this component, when we can just look at into the app index.html file, this index.html file contains an element called as div id root, and this is the place where all my React components get loaded. This div has an id root which will allow me to display all the components which I'm going to create next in my app. And who is going to decide this is going to be my component placeholder is my index.js file. So index.js file has a line of code which is coming from React library, which says that I want to render something at this location. So document.getElement by id is a normal vanilla JS snippet which will just extract or refer to an element on my DOM. Okay, and this is a root element, the id of the element, that is root, which we have seen on index.html file here. So in that element, I'm targeting that particular element to display my app component. So whatever you see here for app is called my JSX. So this is a JSX tag which contains the name of the component with the auto closing tag. So this component refers to my app component coming from the app.js file. So if you look at this, this contains the very first line with React from React library. So this is the basic file which contains all my React based components and library files. So for now, we can just get rid of this logo and app.css, and I'm also clearing off everything which is there between my return. So this is the fundamental structure, and I call this app.js file as a functional component because in React often we use class components, but the component which you see here for app is a functional component, which means it just contains a function which will render the component for me. It is not having any class, or it won't be using any other class based operations in this file. This is a just functional component. Okay, and this functional component goes like this. It says function app, and this function returns something for me like this. So every component is a JSX, what I told you. So now I can return anything here, in anything using this component. For example, I can say h2 and I can say my first React app. So this seems to be a normal HTML tag, but this is not HTML, and this is not any string. This is JSX. Okay, because if it is HTML, we have to enclose it inside a HTML file. We have to include it inside a HTML file. If it is a string, I have to include it between the quotes. But I don't see a HTML file here, and I don't see any quotes also here. So whatever you see here is a JSX, which is just a JavaScript element for this file. So now if you save this, because npm automatically watches your code, any change here, any change which is saved here will automatically re-render the application for me, and you can see I got my first React app on my page without having to reload. This is a function of npm start. So this will automatically keep watching for the changes on my code and update my view like this. Fine. So coming back to my application, so I can create a set of tags like this. So for example, if I try to create a normal paragraph with some content, this is a para. So when I try to save this and go back to my application, it says an error, and the error says that adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So this is a very big nature of JSX, that every component has to be enclosed in a surrounding div, for example, because there should be a placeholder which should combine all the tags which are using within the component. So for now, what I want to do is I can just say a div, a normal div I want to use here. So within this div, I want to push the heading and my paragraph. So when I do this, again it says another error, saying that it has seen a function call instead of an expression. That is because whenever you have multiple JSS tags like this, it is always the best approach to enclose them inside a parenthesis. And this return in JavaScript, generally if it sees a blank space after the return, it will automatically close the return statement then and there. So that is the reason we have to use a parenthesis here, which will tell the return statement that okay, this is not going to close here, there is something else which has to be done within the parenthesis. So I'm now saving this, and you can see my view is back with my heading and the paragraph. So this is a very basic structure of a component, the very first component of my application called as app.js, an app component. Remember, you should put all your tags within a surrounding div for now. Later on, we'll see about the fragments, how to use React fragments to enclose your code. But for now, let us assume that div is a placeholder for my component elements. So now, what if I want to create a new component? So I can create a new component just by opening a new file, and I can save it as show name component. This is the name of the component as show name. Always make sure the good practice is to start your component's file name and the component's name with an uppercase character. And always it's also a good practice to have the extension of your React components as JSX, which will enable a support from the Visual Studio Code. Like whenever you have a file with JSX extension, so you can have the privilege of using the auto code completion and auto suggestions for your JSX syntax offered by Visual Studio Code. So now the name of the file is show component.jsx, or yeah, I can say just show component.jsx. And at the very beginning of this session, I have told we can add an extension called as simple React snippets. Okay, using that I can leverage a benefit of auto completion of some statements. For example, I can use imrc, okay, and a tab which will automatically import the React and component libraries from the React library. These classes are automatically imported, so I can just use imrc to autocomplete this. And now this is going to be a class component, unlike the app component, which is a functional component. So I can create a boilerplate for my class component just by hitting CC and a tab. So this will create a class structure or a class scaffold for me, and this boilerplate I can use to write my component syntax now. So you can see there is one cursor here and there is one more cursor here, which is prompting me to enter the name of this component. So I'm just saying it as name. I'm giving the name as a name for this component. So now I can hit escape, and now I have only one cursor pointer here. If you observe here, it again has render and return statements, which is similar to what we have seen on app component, whereas it is a functional component, and here you are going to see inside the render method, right? Because in your app the name of the method is app itself, but here it's within the class which is having the name of the component. I have a method called as render. Within this render method is the hook which is responsible to display my component. It will always return the component. For example, I can return within this, I can say h3 and my name is Krishna. I say Krishna, right? So this will just display Krishna whenever this component is called. And how do I call this component? So if I want to call this component, I need to call this component in my app component, which is the first component. I can just use the name of the component as a tag format in JSX like this. I can say name, and I can use a closing brace. This will add the name component or show component which I have created here. Within the show component or JSX, we have the name component. So I can access the name component within this component using the name, which is the actual name of the component. And in order to access this name component in my app component, I also need to import the component. So I can say name, which I can import it. So this should actually automatically import it. So this is the feature of simple React snippet. When that extension is added to VS Code, you can just automatically import the classes which you define in the same project. So having my name component imported, and I have also already called this name component within my app component. Let me see what it displays on the output. So I can see Krishna is now displayed on the app component, and this is coming from my name component. But what if I want to display the name just by passing the name from my parent component? Now app component becomes the parent and name component is the child of app component. The thing is, now my name component contains the name Krishna directly inside the component, and this component is the owner of this name. But what if I want to pass the name from the parent, that is the app component in this example? I want to pass the name from app component to the name component. For this, I use a concept of props. So props is a concept in React which is used to transfer or communicate the elements or values from one component, especially the parent component, to the child component. So how can I do that? Just as you do to use your attributes in HTML, the same syntax I can use here. For example, I say first name is equal to Krishna, and because this is a string, I need to just enclose it inside a single quote like this. Else you can have a local variable within your function. For example, I say let first name is equal to Krishna, and I want to pass this first name as a parameter to this component using the props. So here first name is the name of my prop. Props is the short for properties, and first name is my property, and the value here I can just directly pass the first name using a curly brace syntax. So curly brace in JSX is used to read the values dynamically from my function. Okay, because first name is the name of my variable, I cannot directly call it within the quotes. I need to have a curly brace. Within the curly brace, I'm mentioning the name of the variable which holds my first name. So now this is how I pass the name to my child component, that is the name component. And on the other side, if I want to use the same first name here, I can access it just by calling this dot props dot first name. So here props is the properties, and this props is coming, this is actually being a part because we are importing the React and the component as well. The props is part of this component class. Because we are extending this component class, we have the access to the props. The props dot first name, which will call the first name which has been declared as a property in the parent component. So if I go back, and you can see I still see Krishna here, but this time this Krishna is coming from app component, which is the parent of name component. Okay, so let me again try to pass one more component called as last name. Sorry, one more variable called as property called as last name. So let me say this is going to be kvess, like this. So I can just also pass this last name like this. I see last name is equal to the last name which I have here. And the same way as I used for first name, I can also use a space here, and then I can call this dot props dot last name. So here I can see I got my first name and last name here. So that is how I use the props property, or the props uh, function, or the props for facility provided by React to pass the variables from parent to child. But there is also one more way of declaring and using a component based data. It is called as state. In this example, we have seen the first name and last name are passed as the local variables of this function. But in React, every component can have its own set of data called as state. For example, now my name component has, this is a class component, and you can use the states with class components only. And my name component, when I created it, by default it is having a state property. So the state is an object which holds the data which is for that particular component in which it is residing. So the state component, for example, this time I want to include two properties called as the phone, and it is going to be some random phone number, and email. Let's say Krishna at the rate of kvss.com, something like this. So this component has the properties coming from the parent called as first name and last name, and same component has state properties called as phone and email. So this phone and email are declared inside the state property, which holds the data for this component, for the name component, and I can access them using, for example, I want to display the phone and email like this, where I say email is this dot state. So I need to use the expression because this is an expression. I have to say this dot state dot email, and the phone is going to be this dot state dot phone. So when I save this, one second. So I need to surround all these elements within a common div. So there should be a parent by default. So I'm using a div again, which will hold my elements of this component. So if I go back and see, I have Krishna KVES, which is coming from the props, and email and phone number are read from the state. So state holds the component's data local to itself, whereas the props come from the parents. So whenever you are calling a component, you can use props to send the data to a child. And if you want to declare some private data for a component, you can use state. And how to use the state and the actual web projects which are developed using React, and how to make advanced calls, and how to display advanced or complex components using states and props, we are going to cover in the next video. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.
nice day.